edition of the Keele Law After Hours Talking Research sessions. We are going to be having a very informal kitchen table kind of discussion about International Women's Day, what it means to us, and how it takes on maybe a different meaning during the current times that we kind of find ourselves within. So I'm joined with some lovely colleagues from the GSL Research Cluster, and we'll be talking about that today. This is a creation, this whole series, isn't it? It's a creation by Mario Prost, Dr. Mario Prost, who can't unfortunately be with us today, but he will be editing after we finish talking. So, right, we want to begin with like a few kind of an introduction from anyone who wants to go first. Just talk a little bit about yourself and kind of what inspires your past and current research, and we'll go from there. Who wants to go first, everybody? Sam, do you want to go first?
Oh, okay, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Sen Raj. I'm a lecturer here at Keele, and a lot of my research kind of is animated by my own life, essentially. I'm a queer, brown migrant, very proud of all the elements of my identity, and I focus most of my research around kind of LGBT rights and migration and refugee rights. And so my work crosses a lot of themes, and I think particularly talking about this in relation to International Women's Day is really significant because, of course, we know the history of International Women's Day is around striking, right, around collective organizing for change, for social justice, and thinking about the power of communities when they work together to really kind of put a cog or put a wrench, rather, to be a wench in the works, to quote some famous in the machine, in order to basically upend some of the kind of really horrible and kind of disturbing institutions that marginalize people on a whole range of issues, whether that's their sexuality, their gender, their race, their religion, whether they have a disability. And so for me, I'm really interested in kind of thinking through those intersections, and International Women's Day is, one of those wonderful moments for us to really not only celebrate that, but also think about what we can still do and what we still need to do.
Fantastic. Thank you for kicking us off with that. Fabienne?
Yeah, this is beautiful. Thank you for the introduction. It's got me going as well. So a full disclosure, I'm having a bad day today. So this has really inspired me to talk a little bit as well. So my name is Dr. Fabienne Emmerich. I'm also a lecturer in the school. And my research initially was about looking at the production of the resistant or the unempowerable subject in prison, with a focus on the Baader-Meinhof group, and looking at sort of the gender dimensions of that. And it's now moved on to looking at the production of the feminist subject position in post-war German penal reform. So looking at how, in particular with a focus on a woman called Helga Einzeler, who was a feminist, socialist and pacifist, but also a prison governor for very many years. So looking at the kind of the binaries between reform and abolition, and how she kind of traversed those terrains and in essence ultimately got co-opted, erased and cancelled. So this is sort of where the direction the research is going, but I'm right in the middle of that. And on the other hand, I'm very much now, and I think the pandemic has magnified this, there's an internal drive in me to look for community. And I think this is where it ties in with International Women's Day. I think this about speaking up, and this links in with what Sen was saying, collectivizing, speaking up, trying to kind of break down barriers, but also kind of, stopping this normalization that is taking place. I mean, I was trying to reflect on the first lockdown, and now I can't even remember which lockdown we're in now. It's sort of, everything is becoming normalized, and in one sense it's maybe a way of coping because we can't live in an extreme environment all the time, but it hides everything because we are living in an extreme situation, a hyper situation that has been, and I think there was a moment when everything got broken open and this light was shone on these systemic inequalities, and now since the autumn it feels like people have, not people, but something has come and just patched over. And I think this is why it's important to to draw on these strong women and people who really kind of said we need to be outspoken and we need to keep going because it's so much easier just to be silent and compliant.
Thank you. That's great. Oh, I'm so excited. Jane, would you like to add to that as well and introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you so much. And listening to Sen and Fabienne, I think there's so many links and synergies in the way that we feel compassionate about the work that we're doing. So my name's Dr. Jane Krishnadas. I'm a senior lecturer in law and I'm the convener of the Clock Initiative. I think my work is very much founded, again, as Sen said, in who I am, as a woman that's grown really in my sort of research journey as well, because my research began when I was what I thought was a young, free, independent woman who had the privilege of being able to go over to India at that time to do voluntary work, which became a sort of long-term research engagement. And I worked in the relief camps in Latur in Maharashtra, lived in a tin shed for 4 years, and I worked with women's groups in 7 different villages. And I used to hold weekly meetings, so Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, in the 7 villages with 7 groups of women. And as a young English, just in fact a Keele graduate at that, just come out of law school, I felt that I had a certain amount of autonomy, I had agency, and I felt that I wanted to do what I could. So it was a combination of compassion, but also a sense of feeling an injustice as the women in the villages were trying to reconstruct their lives. So for 4 years, I listened to their voices and tried to engage, to sort of mobilize and see how we could move forward together. And as the years went on, I learned very much from them. And I suppose my own agency changed as I lived in India for a longer period of time. And then indeed, I married and I became a mother myself. And I realized that many of the expectations and the notion of being able to act freely was something that I hadn't considered in my own context. And has stayed with me. So in my own experience and engaging with women in the villages for a long period of time, I understood that our agency isn't necessarily inherent. It's something that's very much constructed by the structures around us. And so my research has really focused on the difference between agency and structures, thinking about our personal agency, our capacity, but also our location as we change, as we live in different spaces and how that impacts us. So I've been deeply influenced by Indian feminist scholarship and post-colonial scholarship, particularly the works of Nivedita Menon and Ratna Kapoor, and sort of thinking about how can we affect change. And this was then played out through a series of rights interventions, from community legal awareness to individual litigation strategies and a public interest litigation case. So I've learned through listening, through engaging, and that has very much founded the work of Clock, which again was developed through listening to women's groups locally, and understanding how we can effect change through right strategies. So quite a long introduction, but I hope reflective of how I've learned on my journey. Thank you.
Yeah, a long one, but an important one. Thank you, Jane. This is great. Yeah, and finally, I'm Flick. I am a PhD candidate in the School of Law, and I'm a graduate teaching assistant. And yeah, like everybody else's research, my research is motivated by who I am as a queer person, and yeah, this real sense of injustice. Like my work is very much inspired by Black feminist tradition, right? So particularly abolitionist, prison abolitionist trajectory. So Angela Davis's work, Ruthie Gilmore, all of these amazing, Adrienne Marie Brown, all of these cool, amazing writers, organizers, and so looking at, especially in the current times, about how obviously marginalized groups, you're all talking about how marginalized people and groups are how COVID has really exacerbated this period, that this kind of feeling of injustice, but the material realities that these groups face. And my own research is looking at how incarcerated transgender women are, you know, I don't want to say doubly, but kind of there's a multi-layers of exclusion, you know, oppression within the penal context, right? Especially during this time with the pandemic. So we have this on the inside of the prison, but we also have this on the outside as well. So seeing how these exclusionary feminist discourses are operating at the kind of the private level, but also in more public spheres as well, and how that is directly affecting how, you know, trans women are able, and trans feminine people are able to live their lives, and the constraints and different the multi-layered pressures that they face, and how really that represents an extension of carcerality, doesn't it? Because it's ultimately restraining, constraining, and it's shaping, not always in a, well, is it ever if it's carcerality, but not in a positive way. So yeah, that's great, that's me. So we'll move on then, because I feel we were all wanting to talk a little bit about COVID and the pandemic, because of what is happening right now. I think it might be a good thing for us to start then and think about maybe what International Women's Day means for us during the current period, and how COVID-19 has maybe illuminated some of the existing inequalities that we were talking about. So if anyone wants to speak to that, that'd be great.
Okay, so I think one thing that I found to be really powerful in this particular moment is how, you know, International Women's Day and kind of the notion of women's work broadly, right, which gave rise to this idea that, you know, why is it that the domestic space or the home space is often treated as, you know, nurturing work, caring work, uncompensated labor, essentially. And in this time of COVID, we're seeing this heightened interest in the home, right? The home becomes our haven, so to speak, because the virus transmits in social public space. And of course, the home is our shield against that. But as we know from the work of many feminists over the years, socialist feminists, critical race feminists, post-colonial feminists, you know, queer feminists, the home is anything but haven, right? For people who have childcare responsibilities, who have the added pressures of working as well as, you know, educating children in the home, for people where the home is a site of violence, you know, of intimidation, of harassment, of abuse by parents or spouses, you know, for queer kids who can't be who they are in the home because they'll be put out on the street, quite literally. And obviously that's a very dangerous, even more of a dangerous place to be. So in many ways, the home, which has come to represent, you know, historically and currently, this place of safety and security, as we know, is anything but. And COVID has really shown that for specific groups of people, it isn't. And, you know, we have to really thank the work of feminist organizers and feminist scholars, and, you know, who have been putting this work into the spotlight. And essentially, you know, this is the impetus for International Women's Day, you know, the striking around a refusal to accept that these should be the conditions in which we live. And so I think it's so pertinent for us to be talking about COVID in relation to International Women's Day, particularly because the home has come to occupy this very fraught space for many of us trying to navigate it.
Absolutely. I mean, if I can just join in there, certainly our work with CLOC since the pandemic, we have seen an increase in requests for support because of COVID, because of lockdown. Now, definitely we've had those requests before COVID and before lockdown, but what we're seeing is just this being accentuated, and you know, risks to family members in the home. So this whole notion that stay home, stay safe has become a sort of public rhetoric. And yet we know, and we know this from the National Domestic Violence Helpline, we know this from, you know, Women's Aid, we know that the statistics are out there, you know, in the public domain, perhaps more than they've ever been. But still, we don't have the options. So the options of where do you go? I'd written an article with Sophia Hayat Tahar about the public and the private space during COVID. And in that time, we were trying to get places in the local refuge, and I wrote to the local MP, and he accepted the fact that the refuge was full. Our local solicitors are now working sort of 25%, 100% capacity. Our courts have a backlog of hundreds of cases that they're not able to process. And our local authority is struggling because where they would normally monitor children for their safety in the school, they no longer have that reach. So we're getting this invisibility of abuse because it's behind closed doors, which of course then, as indicated, feminist discourse has highlighted for decades. I know in my own experience, having faced difficulties within the home, there are very, very few options. And I think what we find is that it's, as I say, it becomes much more magnified when you're having to balance caring and work as well. So we're probably all under significant pressures. And certainly I think feminist discourse has been critical in highlighting these issues and making these issues known, but the structures haven't adapted. And I think that will go back to our sort of conversations as we progress around, the role of law in this, because even though we're trying to process legal cases at the moment, what does that mean and how effective is law to actually speak to the issues when law in itself is constructed as a public tool?
And I think this is so interesting because in the first lockdown, what really became clear was that actually there was a revaluing of care, wasn't there? All of a sudden we realized, and I think the politicians realized, that the people who were key to our survival were the people who were contributing, were caring. So whether it was not just doctors and nurses and healthcare workers, and other people who worked in the hospitals, but also people who produced, crucial to infrastructure, people in warehouses, people in retail. So actually, we didn't need any management consultants or all these people. They didn't, that are usually valued highly because of the supposed production of capital. They weren't deemed essential. However, somehow this has gotten lost again. So we have all this backlog, we have this amazing amount of data and activism, but at the heart of feminism, we have this huge divide where there is infighting going on rather than collective. So we need to somehow find a way to collectivize in a sense, and these voices become, these voices come together because these voices are there. You said all the data is there. Why is it not being heard? Because there's money being spent. There's money being spent. So they are making huge amounts of debt, but somehow the prioritization is wrong.
Yeah. I agree with that. It's making me think a little bit what you're talking about the Feminism for the 99% book, which is a little manifesto. It's not little, it's great. It's a really good critique on capitalism more generally, and it speaks to, for sure, what we're experiencing in the current period. And this idea of solidarity, having sites of solidarity at this moment is more important, isn't it, than ever. So focusing on these kind of infighting things that merely bolster the system and don't interrogate the kind of the deeper level issues that we're all experiencing. It's really frustrating to see that the movement is fractured in this way. Obviously you always get fracturing and that kind of thing, especially on the left, but it's not helpful to the overarching course as well, isn't it? And it's making me think about recently, I don't know if you've seen this, but this, after years of recognizing the harm of prison, but in the government's kind of mind, how harmful it is for women specifically. There's now this push in the midst of a global pandemic to expand the women's prison estate. Now, we know already the harm of prison and that women, everyone, right, needs access to basic, housing, mental health services, food, shelter, all of these things. And yet we're plunging more and more money into these really violent carceral spaces when we know that they do very little to address these root causes, but also to make a meaningful intervention in these women's lives and all people in the women's prison estate, right? So to me, it's just why are we, I mean, we talk about this a lot, but why are we investing our efforts in things that are surface level that are also hugely harmful and dangerous, and don't engage with the material harms that the system is already doing on the outside, in these people's lives. So, yeah.
I think that's a really good point, Flick, and it really brings to the fore this idea of what is a symbolic intervention and what's a material one, because as we talk about International Women's Day, it's a symbol in itself, and certainly a lot of people have turned International Women's Day into a sort of corporate symbol as well. Women on boards and executives and women in politics, but of course we know that so much of the work that happens in the kind of quote unquote lower tiers of professional work and domestic work, right, by people who aren't already enabled in those ways to earn millions of dollars or pounds, or to be a cabinet minister or indeed prime minister. It is at this level that we now, I think, should also address potentially why the radical roots of International Women's Day, and indeed so many celebrations, like Pride, the extent to which now become largely sort of corporate symbols rather than kind of reminders of why we still need to do work and why we still need to organize collectively in the same way that the people who founded it or started it did as well.
Yeah.
And I'd just like to respond as well to Flick's point about the system and the structures, and just, thinking about Sen's consideration of how do we move forward. I think my research right back from, when I was in the villages, it was a process when people's lives were being reconstructed, and they were being reconstructed by the state and indeed the international community. And to see what voice they had in this process of reconstruction. And I think as we come out of COVID and we look at this rehabilitation of society, how are our voices being heard in this reconstructive and this rehabilitative process? And how do we actually engage with the tools that are reconstructing us? So I think as lawyers, in our discipline, we are always in conflict, because we know that law is a tool that has been there for exploiting, for taking resources, for taking ownership of bodies, particularly women's bodies. I mean, women didn't have legal subjecthood. We were properties of men. And domestic violence, when we think about the domestic violence that we've spoken about through COVID, this is all inherent in the way that the man has the domain. So when we think of Audre Lorde's work, sort of the master's domain, and our law is still very much structured that it is very difficult to remove a man from the property. So, the government's advice was, if you are experiencing domestic violence, leave. And then, as I said, the MP, we don't have refuge spaces. So we're still in this construction, whereas the property, and we know this from materialist feminism as well, that it's all the patrilineal structures that we're in. So how do we actually challenge this? How do we engage with law to provide alternatives? And what do we do as legal scholars in that process to sort of navigate? And that's why my work's always been fascinated with the feminist tradition, as to whether law can be subversive. So, whether law can be a subversive site, how do we use law? And of course, with my commitment to Clark, we're in a daily engagement of how do we do this. And I think what I found really positive in the COVID situation is the community justice and the fact that community actors are coming together. So what we're trying to do across the law firms and the charities and the court is actually have a conversation and a discourse to see what would be best. How do we collate evidence? How do we work through to be able to support people? But I think that needs to be done on a big, a more national scale, just as Sen said, those voices that are unheard. And I loved Fabienne's point. When I say loved, it's a kind of sweet sorrow love, because it's very familiar to be co-opted and then to be made invisible. It's something that can happen. So how do we move forward? I just think we're in such a critical time as legal scholars to think through these discourses.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's the same with what the point that Sen made about International Women's Day, the corporatization of it, the scramble. Oh my God, it's International Women's Day on the 8th of March. We have to find a prominent woman speaker. Why? And it's this with Foucault's notion of these. It's the subjugated voices that are important and that are doing all the groundwork, and it kind of cements again this inequality of actually the people who put in the labor of trying to create community, of trying to create alternative structures or subversive structures that are then erased or hidden or co-opted, whereas certain people who are deemed to have kind of breached the glass ceiling, the one person who has made it, is then held up high. And I think that's, one of the reasons why there's an underlying seething anger that, and I think it's probably a healthy one. And then I kind of that link to the point of what we're experiencing in terms of what's now going on in terms of EDI, the Race Equality Charter, decolonizing the curriculum, all these initiatives that are now being institutionalized as a way of saying it, tick box exercises. And like you're saying, how do we as lawyers, on the one hand, we're in institutions and we are experiencing governance strategies and policies that are being used to govern in certain ways, and at the same time, the law as another governance strategy, and whether it can be subverted or not. And I think one of the, and I don't want to say it because it doesn't belong to me, and I think you should be saying it, is it reminds us of like Audre Lorde's The Master's Tools, or in terms of feminist, French feminists, avant-garde feminists talking about playing the game of the father. So about how women can also reinforce these structures and within a very supposedly competitive, individualized system, not lift people up, but step on their shoulders, push them down to climb up. And so there is a way. We're all looking. I mean, Flick in the last couple of weeks kept saying to me when I was ranting and raving and angry that you are looking for community. So we are looking in these times of super isolation to connect. And this is why Mario creating this forum where we can actually speak. I already feel it's having a healing effect. So I think your ways in terms of Clock about connecting people and getting them talking and listening to one another in a meaningful way has, and it's been, you've put so much work into this for so many years to do this and to create this whole infrastructure to support people.
And I just want to echo what Fabienne was saying, Jane. I mean, Clock is a feminist intervention. You have worked with so many people over the years to put together something that sees law as an instrument, but not the goal of people's lives.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think, you have built on so much excellent feminist work over the years to really, that we all now use in our own ways, in our distinctive ways, in the different areas that we work in, is this realization that there is so much value in building community. It always comes back to these sorts of points, right? In finding routes to strengthen those communities. Law might be one of those routes in certain circumstances, in certain times, but it is never going to be the only route. Yeah. Nor is it ever going to be the most important route. And that's what Clock, I think, is so wonderful because, as a unique feminist intervention, from my view, it's something that allows our students at Keele, for example, to understand that being a lawyer doesn't simply mean knowing the law. And it is also often a case of doing quote unquote care work, quote unquote feminine work, just as, if not more important.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think the fact that the way the students engage with the role as a community legal companion, that word companion is really key.
Yeah.
Because it highlights that the idea of a legal subject as being autonomous and being able to conduct their own proceedings without emotion. So drawing on Sen's work from Law and Emotion, I think what's been critical to us is that no matter how educated you are, no matter how empowered you are, if you're in a courtroom and you're talking about your emotional, personal situation, and for all of us, it's hard. We still have that distinction between the public sphere and the private sphere in our own way of being. And to expect somebody to be able to convey that into a court, and when it's about whether they may lose their home or lose their child or be in a situation of violence, to have a companion there who is literally there metaphorically to hold somebody's hand, it's trying to demonstrate, to make the court process to be seen as something that actually is human, and that we need each other, so it becomes a relational process. And yes, absolutely. I mean, CLOC has been built on feminist legal strategies, and the whole notion as a transformative methodology is not just to work with law as a static tool, but sort of drawing on Dee Herman's work as well, this notion of, which again based on queer feminist perspectives, that actually law is dialectical, and it's a bridge must be built. There must be a bridge somewhere in order for somebody to engage with law. So the companions as a bridge, I think, is a really critical process, and totally, it's been built on through listening to lived experience of women, which of course is the grounding feminist methodology. So yeah, and collective, absolutely collective. I think also Kimberly Crenshaw's quote that this notion of when somebody enters, we should all enter. But the question is, what are we entering into? And COVID, for me, the post-COVID is, can we reconstruct what we're entering into? Can we make it something different? And for that, it's for people like me who are now, as you've seen, being put on this pedestal without my knowledge, and something that I do find very difficult because of my personal reasons of finding it difficult to be in the public sphere, and that is based on having experienced intimate violence, and knowing how difficult it is to then be put in the public when you've been experiencing difficult times in the private. So for me, I think my role in being on that pedestal, as it were, is to say, actually, we can be quite broken, and we can have struggled. And the only reason we're here is because of our collective and our collaborative ways.
No, I think so good. So many nuggets and everything that you said, all of you. I wanted to go back a little bit. I think Jane started thinking about how our recovery post-COVID might look, and how we can reconstruct into what we're entering into post-COVID. I think something that's really, really, the last year anyway, but especially during this time, for me and Fabienne, but I'm sure for all of us, that's taken on a new kind of importance in our work, is Audre Lorde's uses of the erotic essay. I'm really thinking about, especially during International Women's Day, hearing you talk about the corporatization and the girl boss kind of vibe that International Women's Day has become, right? Into thinking how, Audre Lorde tells us that, we don't have to accept mediocrity. We're this exactly. The erotic is a measure between the beginnings of our sense of self and the chaos of our strongest feelings. It's an internal sense of satisfaction to which, once we have experienced it, we know we can aspire. It's so right. Like, her words are just on it, as we know. But this idea that once we've experienced excellence, we know that feeling, we know how satisfying it is, we know how fulfilling it is, not just in our personal lives, but for those around us, those that we're in coalition with, working in solidarity with. And therefore, we know it's possible. We see the potential, right? It's right in our hands, it's right in our grasp. So for us to accept this kind of neoliberal, girl bossy kind of way of superficially recognizing or, acknowledging maybe that there are issues, but not going deeper down, and having this, transformative sense of like excellence in our personal, but also in the broader scheme of things, is really important, I think, to engage with that, because it challenges not only ourselves, in our work that we do, but it really kind of sets the bar, and it's threatening, but it's threatening in a positive sense, right? I think people often, they balk at transformative change, don't they? And they say it very negatively. They don't want to be outside of the confines of what we already know. But the erotic is telling us that it's possible, and it makes us feel good. So why not set the bar higher? I think that's something for us to really embrace during this time. And we can do that practically as well, not just on a theoretical level. You know, Audre Lorde isn't, you know, saying that, but I think sometimes maybe her words get, you know, how can we affect this in practice? You know, and I think CLOC is an example of that, right? How can we ensure that people in our communities and societies are experiencing the erotic in the real sense, and you're equipping them with the tools, you know, in the legal speaking as a former community legal companion, with someone that can be their guide, right, their light in their times of trauma, when they need healing, when they need reassurance, when they're trying to seek accountability in different ways. I think it is something that we can aspire to. So, yeah.
And I think that's the thing, isn't it? It's it's co-creation.
Mm-hmm.
It's creating. And I think Audre Lorde is this speech is so beautiful because she tells us we should pick the things that make us feel like this. So rather than processing, and at the moment, I think I've just had a week where you can get so entangled in the processing and because administration doesn't have to be like that. It can create, it can do things that are satisfying and pleasing and joyful and connect with people and listen. But we are so bombarded, and oftentimes we lose track. And I think this came out in the reading group that we had, is we know this, and then we come off course a little bit, and then we need to talk to lovely people and have conversations to bring us back onto course and go, actually, yes, you can. And we can pick the things that are pleasurable, that help people, that we co-create things rather than process.
I think as well it's more important. Oh, sorry, Sam, I was just going to say, with this idea of solidarity, I was just thinking about recently, I went to a talk with Abolitionist Futures about the criminalisation of solidarity increasingly. And if we think about the Stansted 15, right, that this is a key case where that we're seeing this in action, and probably can talk about more about this as well. I just think that we're seeing it in lots of different ways, manifesting this, not just criminalisation, but the constraints that are put on our abilities to be in relation with one another and to be in solidarity with one another, because they know it's threatening, right? The people that are against us, they know it's threatening. Sen,
I was going to say, you know, one of the, you know, wonderful things about our little group here is that we are invested in this co-creation. And I think, you know, talking about the GSL, you know, gender, sexuality and law cluster that we have at Keele, it's that we embody so many of the values that International Women's Day initially, when, you know, they were collectivizing and striking and kind of trying to be the wench in the works, to quote Sarah Franklin, you know, to try and embody this kind of disruptive, creative, imaginative space, erotic space, of course, to use Audre Lorde's kind of conceptualization of that, is what we do. And I suppose in many ways we're recording this for this particular day, you know, to mark it. But we should, you know, we also have to take credit for the fact that we are a forever thing. Well, we are an in perpetuity thing. You know, we don't just stop when the day stops, or we don't start when the day starts. We are invested. This is our work. This is what we're animated by, is our communities, and the communities that we can create and we can cultivate. And so I think that's something that, you know, we should all hear on this call, and indeed our colleagues who unfortunately couldn't join us for this lovely kitchen table conversation, you know, to really recognize that we are a community here that embodies this in our practice, in our teaching, in our listening, in our activism. And so in many ways, I think we should also be hopeful, because we are, you know, not to toot our own horns, but maybe we should a little bit just say that we are, you know, things that feel that aspiration, you know, the things that animate us. And I just wanted to, you know, really highlight that and really pay tribute to that, not only to those of us here, but of course the colleagues who have come before us. And of course, Jane has been at Keele and has been one of these founding figures of GSL. So we really have to honor and be grateful for her contribution and continued contribution here, but also to the many colleagues who worked with Jane, who were part of those conversations many years ago. And, you know, we are so much stronger for it.
Yeah, well, I can only just be thankful, because I've been nurtured by the GSL community. The GSL community have enabled me to go into the public sphere. The GSL community have enabled me to put words on paper and for those papers to be read in publications. And when I say the GSL community, you know, Dee Dee Herman, as I've quoted in The Right to Be Effective, a Bridge Must Be Built. You know, Dee Dee, Davina, Ruth, Sally, Michael Thompson, Carl Stitchen, you know, Matthew Waite. I mean, I don't want to say names, and then, but of course, Alex. You know, we have so many. And Fabienne can probably fill in the gaps as well when we think of Sally and Marie Andre, and you know, we've been blessed. And my learning has, Dania Thomas, you know, when we think about how our learning has evolved and progressed and been challenged and critiqued, and as I say, that all to me comes back to how we question law as, you know, as legal scholars. The GSL perspective and the lens has been such an important way for us to critique how we engage with law, but create that community to enable us to, because as I've said, I think it's important and I think it's fantastic that those of our GSL colleagues have such amazing profiles and are out there and are doing the work, but that has all taken a deep amount of struggle. You know, I think for all GSL scholars, there will have been moments in their lives where they've had to cross that boundary to enter those spaces and then create the spaces for others. So I am deeply thankful, and I've been nurtured through, and I'm very thankful to Sen and for Fabienne and to Flick and our colleagues today who are continuing that space, particularly when we get tired, because we also get tired. So having that new energy and engagement and creating those spaces, I think, is critical.
And opening these new avenues of thinking. I remember I arrived here in 1996, and so the internet wasn't really, we didn't really use it that much. And I somehow picked Keele, and then we had all these amazing people teach us, but they were teaching us really boring subjects like legal method. And then you know, and then we go through the library and we found Carl Stitchen's book on homosexuality and the law, and we were like, oh my God, these were sort of watershed moments of, you know, we happened to just arrive in this amazing place that really challenged and broke open any preconceptions and pushed us and took us along. It's this, you know, and it just made us think in so many different ways. It was amazing. And Dee Dee Herman taught contract law. I mean, what a waste.
I think she said brought her own edge. The problem questions were always fun.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what what all of you are saying. Yeah, I mean, I'm on that journey right now. I'm currently on the GSL train, so I'm really, really grateful, not just at the, you know, the public level that you see at conferences or that you read whenever I'm writing, but on a personal level as well, right? It shapes who it's shaping who I am for the good, I hope. And you know, it's enriching, right, in lots of different ways, and to work with all these beautiful and like different people is great, right? And I think we find that all the time. It is really enriching. And I will just say, you know, it kind of pulls on what Fabienne was saying, you know, discovering all these like wonders in the library. There are two, you know, especially with GSL Keele Law people, where I first started my degree and I was like, kind of like, oh, is this the right thing for me? I started here in 2013 with a law single honours, and because of I wasn't quite sure if it was queer enough for me or gender focused enough for me or feminist focused stuff for me. And then I came across Jane's PhD in the library and Alex's book, the transgender jurisprudence book. And for me, I was like, you know what, I'm being taught by these people, and you know, both of their works for sure now, especially in my PhD, are centered. And I just think it really blows my mind every time that, you know, you get to work with these amazing people that produce this stuff, but you're not just working with them, but you're building relations with one another, which are transformative, as you can see, like in lots of different aspects. So I'm so grateful for this conversation as well.
And creating new knowledge.
Yeah.
Creating together, that's what we're doing.
For sure. Just wonderful.
Shall we talk about the kitchen series as well? Because it ties in.
Yeah, so we have an upcoming series as part of the GSL Research Cluster, and this is called Speaking GSL at the Kitchen Table. It's a speaker series where we have a host of really exciting speakers. First up, we have Professor Marie-Andre Jacob from the University of Leeds with her paper in I've forgotten the precise date, but it is soon.
No, 24th of March.
24th of March, which is really exciting.
So we've got our further GSL friend Dania Thomas coming in May,
and then Fiona Londras. Londras and Mairead Enright. Yeah.
In September or October, but and then we've got Davina Cooper in October with her team on the, what's the project called again? It's the
Future of Legal Gender project.
Yeah, and then hopefully we've also got Ruth Fletcher coming in June. So all our the GSL friends.
I have to say, Ruth Fletcher really did a lot of the groundwork and still does a lot of groundwork in creating the spaces. The FLAC, the Feminist Legal Knowledge, the first kitchen table event that was held down in London just as Brexit was announced. I remember everyone in a state of shock as they walked into the conference, and then poured emotions through the conference day, just as if we were all sitting around a kitchen table. So I think Ruth's work in that sort of, methodology of mixing methods and so forth has been fantastic. So really looking forward to hear her again.
Great stuff. Right, we'll wrap it up there then, I think. And yeah, thank you very much for listening to our discussions, and we'll see you soon. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care. Keep safe, everyone, in every way.
You too. Bye.